The warehouse smelled of rust, sweat, and dried blood. Located in the forgotten industrial district of Newark, this wasn't a place that existed on any map. Mike Tyson pulled the hood deeper over his face, his massive frame hunched to appear smaller, less threatening. Nobody could know he was here. Not his parole officer, not Don King, not the media vultures who'd been circling since his release from prison just 4 months ago. The Indiana Youth Center had changed him, not broken him. Nothing could break what Cuz had forged, but refined him, like carbon under pressure becoming diamond. 3 years of concrete and steel, of men trying to prove themselves against the fallen champion. 3 years of staying ready, shadowboxing in a cell barely wide enough to extend his arms. The prison psychiatrist had asked him once what he thought about during those endless hours of solitary training. Mike had simply stared at him until the man looked away. How could he explain that he was having conversations with a dead father figure, that Cuz D'Amato's voice was clearer in that cell than it had been in the mansion? Next fighter. The voice boomed through the makeshift arena, a concrete pit surrounded by chain-link fence and screaming degenerates. Mike had heard about this place in prison from Rashid, a lifer who'd fought here in the 80s before catching a murder charge. "It's pure, Mike," Rashid had said during one of their chess games. "No judges, no politics, no Don King, just truth." He pushed through the crowd, each face a blur of desperation and bloodlust. The warehouse had been a textile factory once, Rashid had told him. Now it manufactured violence for men who'd fallen through society's cracks. Ex-cons, discharged soldiers, immigrants who'd fought in wars Americans couldn't pronounce. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that danced like demons on the warehouse walls. Half the bulbs were dead, leaving pools of darkness between islands of sickly yellow light. Mike's hands, wrapped in dirty tape he'd found in the locker room, trembled slightly. Not from fear, Maya. Never from fear, Maya, but from anticipation. 4 years in a cage, and now he needed to remember what he truly was. The rape conviction had taken his titles, his money, his freedom, but it couldn't take the thing that mattered most, the ability to translate intention into devastation faster than thought itself. Who's next? The promoter, a greasy man with gold teeth and track marks poorly hidden by a cheap suit, scanned the crowd. Mike had seen his type in prison, parasites who fed on violence without ever risking their own blood. The man's eyes were calculating, already counting the money he'd make from whatever carnage came next. Mike stepped forward, keeping his head low. The promoter looked him up and down, saw the thick build, the way he moved despite trying to hide it. Even hunched and hidden, Mike's body betrayed him. The neck muscles developed from 10,000 hours of bridging exercises, the shoulders that rolled with each step like a big cat's, the hands that hung slightly curled, always ready. "You fought before, big man." Mike's voice came out as a growl, deliberately deeper, rougher. "Some." "Name?" "Joe." The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. Joe was nobody. Joe hadn't been on the cover of Sports Illustrated at 20. Joe hadn't made $100 million by age 25. Joe hadn't fallen from the highest peak to the deepest valley. "All right, Joe, you're up against Spider. Hope you said goodbye to your teeth." The crowd parted as Mike made his way to the cage. He could feel their eyes on him, trying to place the familiar gait, the distinctive neck muscles that even his loose sweatshirt couldn't hide. But the beard he'd grown in prison, the extra 20 pounds he'd gained from prison food and depression, the way he'd learned to carry himself differently, it was enough, for now. Inside the cage stood Spider's early 20s, covered in amateur MMA tattoos, bouncing on his feet like he'd watched too many UFC tapes. The kid was maybe 185 pounds, all wire and misplaced confidence. His body told a story Mike had seen 1,000 times: decent high school athlete, maybe some Golden Gloves experience, discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and thought he'd evolved past boxing. The cauliflower ear was too fresh, the scar tissue too thin. A dabbler, not a warrior. Spider's cornerman hyped him up, slapping his shoulders, feeding his ego with poisonous whispers. Mike caught fragments. "Old man, easy money, show these fools what MMA is about." One of them, a skinny white kid with a barbed wire tattoo around his bicep, was filming with a camcorder, recording their boy's certain victory over some random old head. "Look at this old man," Spider shouted to the crowd, getting laughs and cheers. "Somebody call the nursing home, they're missing a patient." The crowd ate it up. Mike recognized the rhythm amidst the pre-fight theater that turned violence into entertainment. In prison, there was no theater. When men fought on the yard, it was silent, efficient, final. Theater was for people who could afford to lose. Mike entered the cage, still keeping his hood up. The referee endures if you could call the drunk ex-bouncer, but Minus gave minimal instructions. His breath reeked of wild turkey and failure. No rules except no weapons, and stop when he says stop. The man's hands shook slightly as he spoke, the tremor of a functioning alcoholic between fixes. Mike nodded, saying nothing. Take your hood off, Spider taunted, dancing closer. Let me see the face I'm about to rearrange. Spider was playing to the crowd, but Mike was reading him like a book Cuss had taught him to read. The way the kid's left foot turned slightly inward, weak knee, probably an old injury. The way he dropped his right hand after every jab, a habit that would get him killed against anyone who knew what to look for. The way his breathing was already elevated from adrenaline and performance. No cardio discipline, no control. Mike slowly pulled back the hood. The warehouse lights caught his face, the distinctive features that had been on every sports page for a decade. The broad nose that had been broken in his amateur days and never quite set right. The gap-toothed smile that he wasn't showing now. The eyes that Sports Illustrated had once called black holes where mercy goes to die. For a moment, just a heartbeat. Recognition flickered in Spider's eyes. His bouncing slowed, the smile faltering, but the kid was too young, too stupid, or too proud to fully process what he was seeing. Mike watched the internal struggle, the part of Spider's brain screaming danger, warring with the part that refused to show weakness in front of his boys. Man, you look familiar, Spider said, still bouncing but with less conviction now. You somebody's uncle? Here to earn money for your grandkids? The crowd laughed. Mike said nothing, just began his breathing, the same breathing Custer had taught him when he was 13 and angry at the world. In through the nose, out through the mouth, controlled, measured, the breathing of a predator, deciding if the prey is worth the energy. But underneath the calm, memories surged. Another young fighter, so many years ago, who'd made the mistake of disrespecting him. Mitch Green in that Harlem street, talking about money owed, about respect, about how Mike wasn't so tough without referees and rules. Mike had broken Green's nose, closed his eye, left him bleeding on Lenox Avenue at 4 in the morning. The commission had fined him, the media had crucified him, but the streets had understood. Some lessons can only be taught in blood. The bell rang amidst a piece of rebar hitting a metal barrel. The sound was different from the clean chime of professional boxing, but it triggered the same response in Mike's nervous system. 40,000 hours of training compressed into instinct. Spider came forward immediately, throwing flashy kicks and spinning punches he'd learned from videos. Each technique was technically correct, but spiritually empty. Movements memorized but not understood. Mike simply moved, slightly, efficiently. Not the peekaboo style everyone knew, but something more primal, more patient. Prison fighting was about conservation, about waiting for the one moment when violence would be decisive. Fight back, old man. Spider screamed, throwing a wild haymaker that missed by a foot. The frustration in his voice was building. This wasn't going according to script. The old man was supposed to be overwhelmed by Spider's youth and versatility. What's wrong? Scared. Mike saw everything in slow motion now. The way Spider's corner was getting nervous, their champion expending energy on air. The way the crowd was growing restless, their bloodlust unsatisfied. The way Spider's breathing was becoming ragged, his mouth hanging open, sucking in air his lungs couldn't process fast enough. In prison, Mike had watched a documentary about persistence hunting, how ancient humans would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. He'd recognized himself in those hunters, not faster than their prey, not stronger but inexorable, patient, letting the prey defeat itself. The crowd was growing restless. They wanted blood, violence, the satisfaction of watching someone get hurt. They'd paid their $50 to see pain, not this strange dance. Someone threw a beer can that clattered against the fence. Boring, came a shout from the darkness beyond the lights. Spider played to them, dropping his hands, sticking his chin out. The kid's ego was writing checks. His body couldn't cash. Another phrase from Cusis, who'd collected such wisdom like others collected stamps. Come on, one free shot, unless you're two. Time dilated. In Mike's mind, the warehouse disappeared. He was back in Catskill, 14 years old, Siggers's hand on his shoulder. The punch that knocks them out is the one they don't see coming. It travels the shortest distance, straight from your soul to their unconsciousness. He was in the gym, working the heavy bag, Siggers making him throw the same punch 1,000 times until it was perfect. Again, Michael, make it shorter, tighter. The power comes from the ground, through your legs, through your hips, focused into a space the size of a quarter. He was 19, standing over Trevor Berbick, the referee waving his arms as Berbick tried to stand on legs that had forgotten how. He was 20, watching Michael Spinks's eyes roll back, 91 seconds of violence that had earned him $20 million. He was 25 in a hotel room in Tokyo, crying as they told him Kuz was dead, that the only man who'd ever believed in him was gone. He was in prison, doing push-ups on his knuckles until they bled, keeping the weapon sharp even as the world tried to dull it. 3 years of judges and lawyers and journalists telling him what he was. 3 years of letters from fans who still believed and others who celebrated his fall. 3 years of looking in mirrors and seeing not Iron Mike but inmate #922335. But now, in this moment, in this warehouse that smelled of rust and poor choices, he was none of those things, and all of them. He was the sum total of every punch thrown, every lesson learned, every moment of suffering transformed into capability. Spider's mouth was still forming the word scared when Mike moved. Not the elaborate combination everyone expected from Mike Tyson, not the brutal hooks that had demolished Michael Spinks. Just one perfect straight right hand, traveling maybe 8 inches, launched from a base of absolute technical perfection. The physics were beautiful in their simplicity. Mike's feet gripped the canvas through worn boxing shoes, toes spreading to create a stable base. The power generated from the ground, traveling up through legs that had squatted 1,000 pounds in their prime. His hips rotated exactly 45 degrees, multiplying the force like a transmission multiplies torque. His core, hardened by 1,000,000 sit-ups, transferred that power cleanly to his shoulder. The shoulder rolled, the arm extended, and at the last possible moment, his fist rotated, the 2 largest knuckles finding Spider's jaw at the precise point where the mandible met the temporal bone. It wasn't anger that guided the blow. Anger was sloppy, wasteful. It was something purer, craft elevated to art, violence distilled to its essence. The sound wasn't like the movies. It was wet, organic, the sound of bone meeting bone at velocities. The human skull wasn't designed to handle. Spider's jaw displaced laterally, the mandible separating from the temporal joint with an audible pop that somehow echoed over the screaming crowd. Mike felt the impact travel back through his arm, clean and satisfying, like a baseball bat meeting a fastball in the sweet spot. Spider's eyes rolled back before his brain even registered the impact. His body went rigid for a fraction of a second. Binti, the fencing response, neurons firing in chaotic desperation, before he collapsed. Not backwards dramatically, but straight down like someone had deleted his skeleton. His legs folded at impossible angles, his arms splayed wide, his head bouncing off the canvas with a sound like a coconut dropping. 6 seconds, from the bell to the punch. 6 seconds to remind the world what Mike Tyson was. The warehouse fell silent, completely, utterly silent. 300 people suddenly remembering how to be afraid. The referee stood frozen, mouth open, cigarette falling from his lips, the cherry exploding in tiny sparks on the canvas. Spider's corner men backed away from the cage, their bravado evaporating like morning mist. The kid with the camcorder kept filming, his hands shaking so badly the image would be unwatchable. Mike stood over Spider's unconscious form, his breathing still controlled, still measured. Blood began pooling under the young fighter's head, where it had bounced off the concrete. His jaw hung at an impossible angle, already swelling purple and black. Saliva mixed with blood created pink bubbles that popped with each labored breath. The silence stretched, became its own entity. In professional boxing, knockouts were followed by commentary, by counts, by trained medical staff. Here there was just the wheeze of Spider's breathing and the distant hum of the warehouse's ventilation system. Jesus Christ, someone whispered from the crowd. That's fucking Mike Tyson. The whisper spread like wildfire. Tyson, Iron Mike. Oh fuck, that's really him. Phones, the few primitive cell phones that existed in 1995, began appearing. People backing away from the cage like it contained something radioactive. Mike could see the calculations in their eyes, the sudden understanding that they'd been mocking, laughing at, a man who'd been trained from childhood to end human consciousness with his hands. Mike looked around the warehouse, seeing the fear in their eyes, the recognition, the primal understanding that they were in the presence of controlled violence beyond their comprehension. He saw himself reflected in their terror, not Joe the nobody, but Mike Tyson, the nightmare that had stalked heavyweight boxing for a decade. He stepped over Spider's body and walked to the cage door. The referee, hands shaking, fumbled with the latch. Mike helped him, gently moving the man's trembling fingers aside to open it himself. The referee flinched at the contact, as if Mike's hands might spontaneously generate violence. "He needs an ambulance," Mike said quietly. His real voice now, the lisp barely noticeable. His jaws broken in at least 2 places, maybe 3. "He'll need reconstructive surgery." Nobody moved. They all just stared, predators suddenly remembering they were prey. Mike could smell their fear, acrid, animal. It mixed with the warehouse's baseline scent of rust and blood to create something primitive, something from humanity's cave-dwelling past, when darkness held real monsters. Finally, one of Spider's cornermen found his courage, or maybe it was just loyalty overcoming terror. He rushed into the cage, kneeling beside his fighter. "Spider, Spider, Spider, wake up." He looked up at Mike, tears streaming. "You killed him. You fucking killed him." "He's not dead," Mike said calmly. "See the bubbles? He's breathing, but he needs help now. Every second you wait, the swelling gets worse." That broke the spell. People began moving, shouting for doctors, for phones, for someone to do something. Mike walked through the parted crowd toward the exit. Behind him, finally, someone ran to help Spider, screaming about ambulances and hospitals. At the warehouse door, Mike turned back. The entire crowd was still watching him, some now holding cameras, others just frozen in place. The promoter with the gold teeth was pressed against the far wall, trying to become invisible. He'd probably made thousands off this place, feeding working-class desperation to bloodthirsty audiences. Now he looked like he might piss himself. Mike pulled the hood back up, but before he did, he spoke, not loudly, but in the silence. Everyone heard him. "I just wanted to remember," he said. "Remember what it felt like before the world made it complicated, before the belts and the money and the cameras, when it was just about the truth that lives in violence." He looked directly at Spider's corner, where the young fighter was being loaded onto a makeshift stretcher made from a door someone had torn off its hinges. "Tell him when he wakes up. It's not about age. It's not about old or young, fast or slow. It's about understanding. Understanding that some men carry darkness that doesn't fade with time. It gets refined, concentrated, like pressure-making diamonds." Mike paused, watching them struggle with Spider's limp weight. The kid's jaw was swelling grotesquely now, already the size of a softball. "Tell him he's lucky. In prison, I learned to hit harder with less motion. Efficiency born from necessity. If this had been the yard, if there hadn't been witnesses," he let the sentence die, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Mike Tyson walked out of the warehouse and into the Newark night. Behind him, the underground fight club that had operated for 7 years would close forever, its owners too terrified of what might happen if Mike Tyson ever decided to return. Spider would recover, his jaw wired shut for 6 months, fed through a straw, never fighting again. He'd tell the story for the rest of his life, each telling making Mike seem more monstrous, more mythical. But those who were there, who saw those 6 seconds, they knew the truth. They'd witnessed something pure and terrible, not a man trying to hurt another man, but a force of nature briefly allowed to express itself without restraint. They'd seen what professional boxing, for all its violence, actually contained and controlled. In the parking lot, Mike sat in his rented Cadillac for 30 minutes before driving away. The radio was off, leaving him alone with the sound of his own breathing and the distant wail of sirens, the ambulance finally arriving for Spider. He stared at his right hand, unmarked, despite the devastating impact. The knuckles weren't even red. Perfect technique meant the force traveled through, not against. Kilmus had been dead for 10 years, but Mike could still hear him. "You're not a boxer, Michael. You're a warrior, living in a time that doesn't need warriors. That's your tragedy. That's your gift." The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars belonging to the truly desperate who'd stay for the remaining fights. Through the warehouse's grimy windows, Mike could see the lights being taken down, people leaving in hurries. By tomorrow, this place would be just another abandoned building in Newark's industrial graveyard. He thought about Spider, probably halfway to the hospital now. The kid would live, would heal, would eventually eat solid food again. But he'd never be the same. Not physically, missing modern surgery could work miracles, but mentally, spiritually. He'd carry the knowledge of those 6 seconds forever, the understanding that there were levels to violence he'd never imagined, depths he'd been lucky to survive approaching. Mike started the engine. Tomorrow Don King would call about his comeback fight. The Vulture could smell money from 1,000 miles away, and Mike's presence at an underground fight would leak eventually. Trainers would measure his reflexes, test his cardio, plan his resurrection. The media would craft narratives about redemption and second chances. But tonight, in a warehouse that shouldn't exist, fighting a kid whose name he'd already forgotten, Mike Tyson had touched something essential, something that prison couldn't take away, that age couldn't diminish, that fame couldn't corrupt. The truth that Kumail had seen in a 13-year-old boy from Brownsville, that some people are born with lightning in their fists and thunder in their hearts. He drove through Newark's empty streets, past check-cashing places and liquor stores, past corners where other kinds of violence played out nightly. The city looked different now, smaller somehow. Prison had changed his perspective. These streets that had once seemed hard were playgrounds compared to the yard at Indiana. At a red light, Mike caught his reflection in the window of a closed barbershop. The beard was coming off tomorrow. The extra weight would follow. Joe would disappear, and Iron Mike would emerge again, polished and packaged for public consumption. But Joe had served his purpose. Joe had let him touch the root of what he was, underneath all the layers fame had added. The light turned green. Mike drove on, back to his supervised housing, back to the terms of his parole, back to the gilded cage of celebrity. But for 6 seconds in that warehouse, he'd been free. Not from prison or parole, but from something deeper, the weight of other people's expectations, the need for him to be either monster or martyr. 6 seconds, one punch, a broken jaw, and a broken illusion. Mike Tyson was back. He'd never really left. The next morning, the Newark Star-Ledger ran a small item about an unidentified fighter hospitalized with a broken jaw from an underground boxing match. The police investigated briefly, but found nothing. The warehouse had been mysteriously cleaned out overnight. No witnesses willing to talk. Spider, through his wired jaw, claimed he couldn't remember who hit him. But in certain circles, in gyms and bars where real fighters gathered, the story spread. How Iron Mike had appeared like a ghost, destroyed a young challenger with a single punch, and vanished into the night. How he'd moved differently, fought differently, but the power's God, the power was still there. Refined by rage, hardened by incarceration, waiting. Some said it was just an urban legend, another myth added to the Tyson legend. But those who were there, who saw Spider's jaw explode, who felt the air change when Mike removed his hood, they knew. They'd witnessed something that belonged to an older, more honest age, when disputes were settled with fists, when men carried their reputations in scar tissue and broken bones. Mike never spoke of that night publicly, but years later, in quiet moments with trusted friends, he'd sometimes mention it, how he'd needed to touch that rawness one more time, how prison had made him question everything about himself. Was he still the destroyer Kuss had forged, or just another has been drowning in his own mythology? 6 seconds in Newark had answered that question. The skills could rust, the body could age, the mind could fracture, but the essential thing, the dark gift that made him Mike Tyson, that was eternal. It lived in his DNA, waiting, not for glory or money or headlines, but for moments of pure expression, moments when the civilized world fell away, and all that remained was the ancient arithmetic of violence. Spider eventually became a trainer himself, specializing in defensive techniques. He'd tell his students about the importance of respect, of never underestimating an opponent based on appearance. He'd show them X-rays of his reconstructed jaw, held together with titanium plates and screws, a cautionary tale written in metal and bone. And sometimes, late at night when the gym was empty, he'd touch his jaw and remember the moment he'd called Mike Tyson an old man, remember the silence before the punch, remember learning that legends don't age. They just wait for opportunities to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. In the mythology of Mike Tyson, the Newark warehouse incident became a footnote, overshadowed by his return to professional boxing, his ear-biting infamy, his eventual transformation into a cultural icon. But for those who study violence as an art form, who understand the difference between sport fighting and something more primal, those 6 seconds represent something profound. They represent Mike Tyson at his most essential, stripped of promotion, pageantry, and professional constraints. Just a man with impossible power and the knowledge of how to deliver it. A reminder that beneath the celebrity, the controversy, and the cartoon character he'd sometimes become, there lived something truly dangerous. Something that didn't need anger to function, didn't need hatred to motivate it. Something that existed because nature, in its infinite creativity, sometimes produces creatures designed for a single purpose. Mike Tyson's purpose was written in those 6 seconds, in Spider's broken jaw, in the silence of 300 witnesses too afraid to speak. He was what Cus D'Amato had always said he was, not just a fighter, but fighting itself, given human form. And on that night in Newark, in a warehouse that no longer exists, fighting briefly showed its true face. It looked like Mike Tyson. It always had.